UNGA. You were inside, inside their meeting with President Trump. So, how did it go? Would you call it a success?
You were also inside in the very beginning, and I was able to test the questions. And thank you so much. I think first and foremost, it was a fifth meeting since the beginning of year between the two presidents, President of Ukraine and President Trump. I think it was the most thorough and long meeting presidents had. There was a very wide agenda, so there was an actual briefing on the military situation, there was an actual discussion about the economic situation, managing of the Russian frozen assets and what would be European approach in terms of putting pressure. There was a discussion on the mineral deal and the first success stories after its enforcement. There was a discussion about air defense and many other things. So it was a thorough, long meeting. There was a very significant group on the President Trump side. Secretary Rubio was there. Secretary Bessent was there, Steve Witkoff was there, and on our side as well, it was Chief of the Office, Security and Defense Chef, Foreign Minister, and myself.
We both were in the Oval when that notorious meeting happened between President Trump and President Zelensky, and now we see a major shift in the White House's perspective on Ukraine from you don't have the cards to take your territories back in full. So you were in the office, in the room after we walked out, as you said. So can you tell me more about the tone of this conversation and what actually pushed President Trump to change his mind?
Definitely, and this is the one thing I've been thinking throughout all of the meeting, because last time definitely I was in the Oval over the first meeting after inauguration, but I think there is a major shift because both sides have gone through a long way. President Trump had a meeting and a phone calls with President Putin. He made numerous promises and spread a lot of incorrect information. Steve Witkoff, went to Moscow many times. There were a lot of different contexts. And finally, the meeting today was about trust. I have the sense that President Trump trusts to President Zelensky, to his intentions, to what he speaks, to the information he's providing. And it would not be possible if all of this long way would not be happening before this meeting. So I think I can really, say that this was a thorough and long meeting, but there was a lot of trust in the exchanges, there was a lot of confidence in the information, and I think when you have it as a basis, all the other arrangements are really well structured.
President Zelensky has been talking about security guarantees from the United States, and Ukraine had signed multiple agreements in the past, the Budapest Memorandum that never worked, the agreement last year under different administration here. So what kind of security guarantees are you expecting, and is President Zelensky expecting from this administration so that they work?
Well, if I may say so, probably I'm not sure that I can, but I think when all the previous security arrangements were signed, it's like something up to 30. It was about securing military support for years ahead, and it was vital, and it perfectly lies within the narrative of the previous years that we should keep Ukraine fighting, right? So then the arrangement signed, having a multi-year commitment in terms of military support perfectly fitted this narrative. But now we have the President of the United States saying, I will help to end this war. And now when we're speaking about security guarantees, it's totally different. And what my president says is that the contribution from the United States to these security guarantees is really vital and important. And if we're speaking about ending the war and preventing another aggression, it's something very hard, serious, and something that would deter the aggressor from even thinking of a new aggression. So there is a significant amount of components there. The dialogue is going really well. It's well structured from the European and Ukrainian side, and US will as far as I understand, identify its contribution when European leaders will, structure their role in that.
President Trump pointed out some sort of hypocrisy, if I say so, from the European allies who keep purchasing Russian oil and Russian energy resources in the midst of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So, and now we hear from Ursula von der Leyen and from others that, yes, Mr. President, you are right, referring to President Trump, of course. So, what's your take on this shift of the European strategy?
Well, nothing in European strategy can be surprising for me. I've been part of European strategy for years, and I know perfectly well how things are working there. And I think this is what means when we saying the unity. When there's like a major democratic allies are splitted in their domestic, turbulences, and they're not able to get united to do something really big to prevent crisis or to stop the war or to put real pressure. This is what's happening. The fragmented actions are taken. But now when US is getting on board, it helps the unity within European Union to take a joint effort. And I think this is what is happening because, in no reality, EU could really draft the 19th package of sanctions overnight, or a week after going to DC. This has always been on the table. It's just, the moment has come to make it work.
And today we saw the First Lady of Ukraine meet the First Lady of the United States, Olena Zelenska, met with Melania Trump. So how does the soft power work here, and does it bring any results?
Well, I think there was a meeting, and it is good. It's really hard to make any judgment because First Lady of the United States and First Lady of Ukraine, they don't have a really political agenda. Of course, Madam Zelenska is a wife and a First Lady of a president of a war country. So this imposes a number of different obligations and views and the burdens she shares with him. But I think the major purpose of this meeting was to meet each other, to establish a contact, and just to show to one another that they're supporting their husbands, they're there by their side. And I think it was more about having a good personal contact without any, big agenda or anything like that.
Previously, Madam Zelenska addressed the issue of abducted Ukrainian children stolen by the Russian Federation. Would you expect that they would bring it up at that meeting?
I think, first there was a coalition of abducted children, Ukraine-Canadian coalition with many leaders presented, with First Lady and President Zelensky there, with Andriy Yermak putting this all together as a coalition, which evolved in a very strong resolution. General Kellogg was present there, so the American presence wasn't sure there. But I think something that resonates both to the First Lady of the United States, but also to the First Lady of Ukraine, is the future of the young generations, the future of new generations. Each of them addresses things in its own ways. U.S. has its own challenges. We have challenges of war, and I'm sure they could really find a common ground on this basis.
The last one, you are basically making your first steps as the main person representing Ukraine here in the United States. What are the main challenges ahead of you, and how are you feeling? Because I'm pretty sure today was stuffed with events, talks on the sidelines, in the rooms. How are you feeling?
Well, for me, it's perfectly fine because this is the rhythm which is perfectly normal to me. It's absolutely a different role. And I think that the major religion I have faith in since the beginning of war started, if there is anything I can do for my country and for my children, for my family to sleep well, to continue living in a country they love the most, I will do it. So I'm at the service, I'm at the mission. I have a privilege and honor to represent the Ukrainian people, but also the president of Ukraine, who has appointed me to this position and entrusted me the most complicated topics of the agenda. So whatever I can do on this position, I will do, and whatever help I can provide to Ukrainian authorities, be it the foreign ministry, be it the government of Ukraine, be it the office of the president, and the support of the efforts the chief of president's office is taking in terms of mobilizing the discussion around security guarantees and ending the war, I will do it. So my service is unconditional to the country.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, the Ukraine ambassador to the United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
What is Europe?
I never had a space to talk about it.
How is Europe managing?
I think that just makes us stronger.
Who is Europe?
They don't want us anymore.
Authentic stories from all over the continent. Spotlight on people.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who gets to judge who's big or small?
Dieting is deeply political.
Black women were framed as the antithesis of white femininity.
A history of weight and who holds the scale.
Российская агрессия, ситуация в Украине. Мы будем в прямом эфире на протяжении...
Conflicts, crises, wars around the world. Everything is connected. Mapped Out shows the geopolitical reality beyond the borders. What makes things the way they are? And where are the solutions? Mapped Out, navigating a changing world. Now on YouTube.
Hello and welcome to Focus on Europe. Nice to have you with us. Many countries around the world are currently facing economic challenges, and the United States is at the center of it. It all started in April when US President Donald Trump announced massive tariffs on imported goods for a large number of countries, including nearly all European ones. He unveiled his plans at a White House press conference, calling them a liberation for the US economy. For an economic powerhouse like Switzerland, the tariff plan is a serious blow. Not being a member of the European Union, the country faces some of the highest customs tariffs in its trade with the US. But Switzerland is also known for its legendary inventiveness. So while the situation persists, some companies are finding creative ways to sidestep the problem.
Thermoplan, based in Switzerland, builds coffee machines exclusively for Starbucks. They're made of more than 1,000 parts, some assembled by hand. The family-run company and the coffee giant have had a successful partnership for nearly 30 years. Now, tariffs threaten to unravel it.
It was a total shock, like a punch to the gut. It was a real setback and really disappointing. We felt so powerless. Why are Swiss exporters being treated this way? As far as we're concerned, it's not fair.
This department produces only for Starbucks, their most important customer. The machines are easy to spot thanks to their copper-colored casing. Thermoplan builds about 40 automatic Starbucks coffee machines every day, but now a 39% tariff applies to every unit shipped to the US.
This is our core business, and it's really demanding. We want to keep our partnership with our customer, but now we're losing several 100,000 Swiss francs per week. That's money we could be investing in our company or customers. Instead, it's going to the US government as punitive tariffs.
The company now thinks outside the box. Steiner's new hope lies with a Chinese billionaire and tea house chain owner who wants to bring Chinese tea culture to Europe. Thermoplan is transforming a coffee machine into a fully automated tea brewer.
Instead of brewing coffee from coffee beans, we can use different types of tea, including green tea and oolong tea. Our machines can brew fresh tea beverages too.
Switzerland's free trade agreement with China could offer a way out of the tariff crisis. For Steiner, another option would be to move production to Germany, a strategy many Swiss tech firms are now considering. More than 30% are planning to shift operations to the EU. Whether it's cheese, watches, or machines, Switzerland's economy depends on exports. And the US is its biggest trading partner. The tariffs are already taking a toll, and there's more trouble ahead. Swiss chemical and pharmaceutical exports could soon face tariffs of up to 250%. That's Switzerland's most important foreign trade sector by far.
Fortunately, there haven't been any bankruptcies yet, but some companies have started laying off staff. We also know that several companies in our association have not only introduced or are continuing short-time work, they're discussing layoffs. It all depends on how long we're stuck with this 39% tariff.
To avoid the worst, Swiss companies are increasingly turning to German production sites, like Ypsomed, a medical device maker. Their key products are pen injectors that can be filled with insulin, for example, for use by diabetics.
We're shipping these pen components to the US today, but now we're trying to move these orders from Switzerland to Schwerin, Germany, to bypass the tariffs. We plan to keep producing new orders for other countries here in Switzerland.
Ypsomed is now expanding its existing site in Schwerin significantly, creating more than 500 new jobs.
Germany and the EU have better tariff conditions with the US, and we want to take advantage of that.
Take advantage, yes, but join the EU? Michel says no.
Switzerland is confident, maybe sometimes a bit too confident. We have 9 million people, while the US has 400 million. We need to acknowledge that balance of power and present a clear trade package.
A new offer is now on the table in Washington, which includes major concessions from Switzerland aimed at reducing the trade deficit. But Swiss companies aren't holding their breath, and many are no longer counting on trade with the US.
For Camille and James, a dream job came true this summer. They beat a fair number of hopeful applicants to become caretakers of a remote island off Ireland's west coast. Not an easy task without internet, medical facilities, or hot water. The couple has been living on Great Blasket Island, a lost place in the sea abandoned by its former human inhabitants, but gifted with an abundance of nature's beauty.
Off Ireland's west coast, in the wild Atlantic Ocean, lies Great Blasket Island. Dramatic, beautiful and remote. But could you imagine spending 6 months on this uninhabited island? These newlyweds are doing just that, swapping modern life for the simple life.
It kind of garners two different reactions from people. Some people will be like, oh, I could never do that, that's so not my thing. And other people are like, well, of course. And I think we're just like the of course kind of people.
37-year-old artist James and creative Camille, 26, were chosen from hundreds of applicants to work as this year's island caretakers. No easy task in a place with no stable electricity, hot water or Wi-Fi.
The job requirements are really just that you're going to be committed to working here every day for the 6 months, you know. Yeah. You're kind of just prepared to get stuck into everything. Like there's various challenges, you know, get thrown at you living out here. So you just kind of have to react to everything and just have a good attitude.
Several kilometres off the mainland, Great Blasket is one of the most westerly points in Europe. A special area of conservation, this unspoiled island is rich with wildlife. But don't let its white beaches and crystal blue waters fool you. Cut off from the mainland in extreme weather, it was abandoned in the 1950s. Its final Irish-speaking residents, now a symbol of Gaelic history and culture, forced to leave. Today, a couple is hired every summer to look after tourists on the hunt for adventure.
You're very welcome to the Great Blasket Island. My name is James and this is Camille, my wife. We're the caretakers of the island. We'll be looking after you for the next couple of days.
James and Camille are busy from morning until night. They maintain a handful of holiday cottages.
So there's 2 coal-burning stoves. There's one in here and there's one in the main living room there next door. There's a bucket of coal for each one and kindling and fire starter.
Hi, here are your teas.
They also run a small cafe with modest supplies from the mainland, pumping water from a natural spring on the cliffside. As darkness sets in, as does the reality of life without creature comforts.
When we first got here, like I was looking for light switches on the walls. That's completely out of my habit now. I don't reach for it. I reach for my head torch, you know? You know, it's serious.
But some things are harder to live without than others.
Showers are lovely. I actually feel like I miss that so much. I have to put it out of my mind and not think about it. We've come up with a lot of ways to MacGyver things though, you know, like collecting cold water and dunking drinks in it, or like trying to keep things cold in different ways.
There's usually something you can do, you know, to kind of ameliorate the situation.
Yeah.
As another clear day on the island dawns, tourists Kiva and Simon say their first night living off-grid went without a hitch.
Oh, I find it really refreshing. I just love it. Yeah. And you have time to read, time to talk.
It's just something completely different, you know, just living by candlelight, away from the sort of things that you used to at home, and just have a bit more time and space, I guess.
But this experience wouldn't be for everyone. Visits to the island stop when storms set in. The local wildlife, the only creatures able to freely come and go. But Camille and professional painter James are unfazed. Often seeking remote living and on the hunt for artistic inspiration, their new roles came as little surprise to family and friends.
I don't think they would have expected that we get the job, but when we did, I think they were just kind of like, of course, they're going to go live on an island for 6 months.
Any concerns about being far from emergency services are further still from their minds.
You can really feel it on the island when you're the only people here. Like, it feels vast. Call it the naivety of being young, but I think we just thought we'd be fine.
As they prepare to return to their lives on the mainland, they say island life's taught them to live in the moment, taking each day as it comes.
Just sitting in the sand, letting the water come up by my hips, and just watching the seals and listening and feeling the wind. It's in those moments that I'm like, this is what I really want to remember and take back with me so I can tune back into that, because it is an opportunity to slow down.
Slowing down is something most of us dream of. but few able to truly experience. But thanks to its caretakers, visitors are able to enjoy the natural beauty of this unique island, when the weather is willing.
Now let's go to Greece and meet Penny and her colleagues. They are undercover tax investigators. Their job is to help increase government revenue by tracking down tax evaders. One of the state's most important sources of revenue is the value-added tax. So whether you're enjoying a great meal at a restaurant or buying gifts to take home, make sure to receive a receipt that shows the VAT. It's a small detail, but it's crucial for the country's financial well-being.
I want the receipt.
We need a printout from the card reader.
Can I ask you, did you get a receipt from...
On patrol with civil tax investigators in Athens. Penny and her team are checking whether businesses in the city center are charging and reporting the correct amount of VAT.
Our job is to boost government revenue and stop tax evasion before it starts.
Low tax morale in Greece is a long-standing issue. The shadow economy costs the state billions every year. Now, the government is cracking down. Inside a jewelry store, one investigator blends in with the customers, quietly watching the cashier. Penny and her colleague wait outside. Everything seems in order. Receipts are being handed out.
Okay, thank you very much.
But just a few streets away, the team spots something suspicious. At a restaurant, they inspect the tables. By law, order printouts must be placed there. They take the waiter aside.
What about the 3 colas?
They haven't been printed yet.
Okay, let's talk.
Of course I entered the orders. I just didn't have time to print them. I'll do it now. A guest held me up.
That's no excuse. They finished the starters.
We find that in 2 tables, they don't have the temporary receipt. This is a tax violation. That's why we should register through our system Elenphos Live the tax violation.
A flashback. 15 years ago, Greece was on the verge of bankruptcy. Drowning in debt, the country had to be rescued by the EU and international lenders. Today, the economy is recovering. Greece has started repaying part of its billions in debt. This is also partly due to the newly established tax authority. In under a decade, it's cut VAT losses by half.
This is an issue that concerns the whole of the Greek society. If we want to achieve equality and fairness, we all need to contribute. We all need to ask for a receipt, for example. I think that over the years, the culture has changed a lot and people have understood that it is, as I said, important to be compliant and responsible.
VAT, or sales tax, is one of the state's key revenue streams. In Greece, it's 24%, slightly above the EU average. Authorities are ramping up enforcement, and not just with undercover agents like Penny. They've also launched an app that lets citizens report missing or fake receipts. Business owners like this barber say they're fed up with high taxes and constant inspections. They feel the small players are being unfairly targeted.
Big companies can write off taxes through investments, for example. But what can I deduct? Where and in what could I even invest?
Back at the restaurant, Penny officially logs the violation. The waiter signs on behalf of the owner. The fine? At least 500 euros. The waiter doesn't want to speak on camera. The team puts on their official vests. The undercover part of the day is over. But Penny says she feels safe, vest or no vest.
Περιμένετε ένα λεπτό. I know that our job is not pleasant for the enterprises, but it plays a big deal how you treat them, how you speak them. If you are respectful to them, they respect you. Την είχε πάνω την απόδειξη.
Next, they go to check a few taxis and their passengers. The investigators check the receipts, and everything's in order.
How much money did you pay? Do you remember? Όταν είναι συμμορφωμένοι.
A good day is when we don't catch anyone. That means more citizens are paying their taxes, and state revenues are growing.
Σημαντικό να το πω για τα έσοδα.
For Penny and her colleagues, the following applies. Trust in tax compliance is good. Control is better.
In Belarus, the latest presidential election earlier this year brought a familiar result. Alexander Lukashenko once again claimed victory. Europe's longest-serving leader has ruled with an iron grip over the past decades. Elections are neither free nor fair, and critics of the regime often end up in prison or, like Hanna Fedorunak, are forced into exile. Hanna narrowly escaped arrest by the police and fled to neighboring Poland. From the capital, Warsaw, she has been organizing protests against the Belarusian regime, hoping one day to reunite with her family.
I just want to see my mother. While I've been away, my sisters became grandparents of a girl and a boy. I haven't met them. I want to see my family, my friends.
Hanna Fedorunak is a political activist from Belarus. She has had to flee her homeland to avoid imprisonment. Now she continues her work from Poland. But what exactly happened? In 2020, Belarus held presidential elections. The country has been ruled for decades by Alexander Lukashenko. Since his first election in 1994, not a single vote has been free or fair. Independent journalists, NGOs, and opposition voices are routinely persecuted.
Then Sergei Shikhanovsky came to us, to our village, and started speaking the truth. That's when I decided to act. I picked up the flag and followed him.
Sergei Shikhanovsky, a blogger, planned to run against Lukashenko in 2020. Authorities quickly arrested him. Hanna says that moment changed everything. She threw her support behind his wife, Svetlana Shikhanovskaya, who stepped in to run in his place.
We started collecting signatures for her. We went to every village.
To help document possible election fraud, Hanna registered as an election observer.
When they counted the votes, there was a huge pile for Shikhanovskaya and a tiny one for Lukashenko.
Still, the Central Election Commission declared Lukashenko the winner. That sparked mass protests across Belarus, which were brutally suppressed by the government. Hanna says she joined the protests and demonstrations and was detained several times. When the police came for her again, she fled to Poland. Today, Hanna works at a shelter in Warsaw for Belarusian political refugees. She says the people arriving now seem even more traumatized.
It's
very frightening there now. The repression hasn't stopped in 5 years. People who live at the shelter don't protest, don't march, don't give interviews. They're deeply intimidated. The regime knows exactly what it's doing.
One person who does want to speak out is Konstantin Shula. He's staying at the shelter while searching for permanent housing. He says civil society in Belarus needs all the support it can get.
For many people, things are harder than ever. And if you can help, even just a little, it matters. Don't stay silent. Keep fighting.
Because Hanna continues to organize solidarity events for the opposition from here in Warsaw, the regime is targeting her family back home.
They came to my mother. My mother is 80, and they searched her home. They detained my niece 3 times.
Hanna's daughter, Lizaveta, fled Belarus 2 years after her mother. She's amazed that Hanna is still fighting the Lukashenko government.
I didn't expect her to launch into such a whirlwind of activity. None of us did. Our mother is the locomotive, and we're the little carriages.
Hanna admits there are moments when she feels tired, discouraged, and ready to give up.
There have been so many times when I've thought, that's it. Tears. I'm done. I can't do this anymore. But there's always something that pulls me back. Something that won't let me stop. It will be like this until victory.
Europe is rich in exceptional local traditions, and I believe this one from the Netherlands belongs to the most challenging. Called canal jumping, it dates back to the 18th century and involves using a long pole to leap across waterways. Today, the custom has become a competitive sport with athletes participating in nationwide events. In Heidenskip, a village of roughly 300 inhabitants, the annual championships are quite a thrilling spectacle.
A moment of quiet before the excitement begins. Michiel Zylstra is making his final preparations for a unique competition using a bicycle tube.
This is resin, super easy to use. You spray it on your hands and on the tube, and you have better grip.
Michiel is 20 years old and hopes to become the Frisian junior champion in vierleppen. Vierleppen is a mix of pole vaulting and long jumping. The goal is to jump as far as you can over a body of water, with a running start and a pole. If you don't fall, that is.
My personal best is 21.48 meters. Today, I'm aiming for something close to 21.
The judges count the best of 3. Michiel's first attempt. A misstep, just under 19 meters.
That was bad. You're not going far like that. Definitely not perfect.
Still, Michiel's parents cheer him on from the stands.
There's so much to it. The run-up, the technique, the strength to clear the ditch. We're really proud.
Michiel is an apprentice shipbuilder. Vierleppen is just a hobby. But like everyone here, he trains hard. The pressure is on. The competition is fierce. Time for a second attempt. 20.66 meters. Michiel takes the lead. But not all of the 200 spectators know the sport. For most here, the jumps are a local tradition. Vierleppen goes back centuries, a technique farmers in Friesland used to cross water ditches in their fields. In the 1950s, it became a competitive sport. Today, it's listed as an intangible cultural heritage of the Netherlands. Michiel first learned the sport in school.
It's a pretty extreme sport. So much adrenaline. That's why I do it.
But in a stroke of bad luck, Michiel's final jump went wrong. He injured his knee and can't compete in the finals. Still, he has big dreams.
That the sport might one day become Olympic.
Olympic Vierleppen, an easy gold for the Netherlands.
Definitely, this discipline deserves a spot in the Olympics. That's all from us for this week. Thanks for your company. Bye for now.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who gets to judge who's big or small?
Dieting is deeply political.
Black women were framed as the antithesis of white femininity.
A history of weight and who holds the scale.
Full lips, smooth skin, more shapely contours. Hyaluronic acid injections are booming, and the look has long become a beauty ideal. Yet, in their craze for self-optimization, people often ignore the risks. Some even end up going blind. From hype to hope and harsh reality, the new face. DW Travel.
Hello there.
Let's go. The sights, the history, the food.
Very good.
Garnished with insider tips and local highlights.
Wow. Welcome. Let's go.
Shall we go that way? Let's go that way.
But also when it comes to sustainability, information and trends, on DW Travel, you can have it all.
This is unexpected. Okay, I have to check this out.
So, you're planning a trip? Make sure you miss nothing about it on DW Travel.
I hope you enjoyed the trip here as much as I did.
What about you? What's your opinion? Feel free to write your thoughts in the comments.
I remember when I brought home my first medal. I was almost crying. It meant so much to me.
It's a story of triumph and of great loss.
Thank God, I'm so happy you made it. We are strong girls, but those faces speak louder than words. Everyone's eyes have changed.
It's Sveta's story, and theirs too.
This wish to perform with the team, to be reunited again. It's a wish to go back in time.
Nice Ladies starts September 27th on DW.
This is DW News, and these are our top stories. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed the United Nations General Assembly, focusing on Russia's war against his country. He pointed out the necessity for nations to work together to defend against aggressors. In a reference to recent efforts among Kiev's allies to come up with security guarantees for Ukraine, he said only strong alliances, only strong partners can guarantee security. Syria's leader, Ahmad al-Sharaa, has become the first president from the country to speak at the UN General Assembly since 1967, turning the page on decades of dictatorship and international isolation. Al-Sharaa took power in January after leading opposition fighters in toppling Bashar al-Assad. Addressing leaders at the UN, he said Syria was reclaiming its rightful place among the nations of the world. Winds reaching 145 kilometers per hour and heavy rain are battering southern China after Typhoon Ragasa slammed into the coast of Guangdong province. The year's most powerful storm caused flooding that killed at least 14 people in Taiwan before moving west into the mainland. This is DW News from Berlin, and remember, you can find much more news on our website. That's dw.com.
The outcry over the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel Live was huge, and perhaps remarkably, in the U.S.'s climate of extreme polarization, crossed party lines. Millions voiced their concern online, on air, or on the streets over what they saw as an attack on free speech, a dangerous crackdown on the media and networks bowing to pressure rather than standing up to it. Now, Kimmel is back on the air, in most of the country at least. But as the president and his regulators vow to continue their campaign against the media, it seems like the battle for the constitutional right of free speech has only just begun. I'm Nicole Fröhlich in Berlin, and this is The Day.
This show is not important. What is important is that we get to live in a country that allows us to have a show like this.
This is about every single worker, every artist, every union member, every voice that deserves to be heard without bowing to the Trump administration.
That's un-American, it's dangerous, and it's something that we need to raise the alarm about.
That I love my country, and but I don't at this time recognize my country.
Also on the day, Donald Trump's 180 from no peace deal without territorial concessions to the belief Ukraine can take back all its territory currently under Russian control.
To be honest, I think most European allies were happy to see this. It's a relief to have something as close to the real situation as possible, but also everyone holding their breath because who knows, tomorrow he may do the opposite again.
Welcome to The Day. It's great to have you with us. In the United States, comedian Jimmy Kimmel is back on air. That's after Disney, the parent company of Kimmel's longtime network ABC, suspended the late-night show following his comments on the reactions to the killing of right-wing influencer Charlie Kirk. ABC was threatened by regulators and the Trump administration after Kimmel said the president's supporters were trying to score political points from Kirk's assassination. Disney brought Kimmel back on Tuesday following public outrage about his suspension and a call to boycott Disney. When he took the stage last night, Kimmel didn't shy away from criticizing his biggest critic, calling the president's attempt to coerce the affiliates who run his show illegal and un-American. His comeback was defiant but also emotional, especially when talking about the assassination of Kirk. Let's listen in.
I've been hearing a lot about what I need to say and do tonight, and the truth is, I don't think what I have to say is going to make much of a difference. If you like me, you like me. If you don't, you don't. I have no illusions about changing anyone's mind. But I do want to make something clear because it's important to me as a human, and that is, you understand that it was never my intention to make light of the murder of a young man. I don't think there's anything funny about it. I posted a message on Instagram on the day he was killed, sending love to his family and asking for compassion, and I meant it, and I still do. Nor was it my intention to blame any specific group for the actions of what it was obviously a deeply disturbed individual. That was really the opposite of the point I was trying to make, but I understand that to some that felt either ill-timed or unclear, or maybe both. And for those who think I did point a finger, I get why you're upset. If the situation was reversed, there's a good chance I'd have felt the same way.
Kimmel then used much of the rest of his opening monologue to criticize the Trump administration's threats against his show, which he sees as part of a bigger pattern.
This show is not important. What is important is that we get to live in a country that allows us to have a show like this. Yeah! I've had the opportunity to meet and spend time with comedians and talk show hosts from countries like Russia, countries in the Middle East, who tell me they would get thrown in prison for making fun of those in power, and worse than being thrown in prison. They know how lucky we are here. Our freedom to speak is what they admire most about this country. And that's something I'm embarrassed to say I took for granted until they pulled my friend Stephen off the air and tried to coerce the affiliates who run our show in the cities that you live in to take my show off the air. That's not legal. That's not American. That is un-American, and it is so dangerous.
Well, hours before Kimmel's show was broadcast, Trump slammed its return. In a post on his Truth Social platform, he said, "I can't believe ABC fake news gave Jimmy Kimmel his job back. The White House was told by ABC that his show was canceled." He went on to say, "I think we're going to test ABC out on this. Let's see how we do. Last time I went after them, they gave me $16 million. David Green is the Senior Staff Attorney and Civil Liberties Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a free speech advocate. David, welcome to the show. Jimmy Kimmel returning to the air, is it a victory for free speech?
Yes, in some ways it is. It's not a complete victory, but it's certainly something to celebrate that ABC heard the complaints from everybody and decided that they were going to put him back in the air, I think much sooner than they had expected to. And I think the biggest proof that this was a victory, both for free speech and also for democratic principles broadly, is how upset the President Trump was about it. So it clearly was not what his expectations are when he first heard that they were capitulating to the threats.
I'd like to talk about FCC Chair Brendan Carr here. What's been his role in all of this?
Yeah, well, as far as we know, I mean, his public role certainly has been to excoriate ABC and to pressure them to fire Jimmy Kimmel and to cancel the show. What he said was, you can either do this the easy way, which seemed to imply that they on their own would just cancel the show, or you could do it the hard way, which I think at the time was pretty much perceived by everybody to mean that the FCC would take some type of punitive enforcement action against them. And then ABC responded shortly after that. There was reporting that executives within ABC said they did not want to do this, but that the pressure from the FCC was so great that they did, even though it was not their own. It would not otherwise have been their choice. So that was his role. I mean, he was the main pressure point from the government, threatening official government sanction against them, and I think that's unconstitutional. I don't think our First Amendment permits that. He's since walked back and said, "Oh, by the hard way, I just meant it would be hard for us because we'd have to initiate some type of proceedings, and that would be difficult for us." But I don't think anyone truly believes that's what he meant when he said it the first time.
Now, he makes these threats out in the open, as does Donald Trump. He has called on other shows to be canceled. He has vowed in writing to go after ABC. Is any of this legal? Would any of this hold up when challenged in court?
Well, I would hope not. I think it's very obviously counter to the First Amendment. We just had a Supreme Court case 2 terms ago that dealt with this idea of when the government can coerce an intermediary, somebody who facilitates somebody else's speech, can coerce them to change their editorial practices and to not publish something the otherwise would have published, or broadcast something the otherwise would have broadcast. And the Supreme Court affirmed a 50-year-old body of law that said you can't exert pressure and threaten official sanction in a way that requires this intermediary to replace their own editorial decision-making with that of the government. And that's clearly what both the FCC and the president intended here and what actually happened. So I don't think that would be illegal. In terms of the president yesterday threatening some legal action against ABC, I, for the life of me, cannot figure out what that would be. But that's not unusual for President Trump to threaten legal action when there's no legal basis for it.
Throughout this week and all the back and forth, commentators have drawn parallels again and again with the behavior of leaders in authoritarian states. In your opinion, is the U.S. in danger of turning into one of them?
Well, we're certainly there's a lot of backsliding happening right now in the U.S. into authoritarianism. I think there's every week brings a whole new set of signs that the danger is fast approaching, if it's not already here in many respects. So yes, it's a very real concern in the U.S. that what this administration sees itself and aspires to be an authoritarian state and is taking great steps to get there. And I actually think the capitulation by sort of major corporations who exert tremendous power in the U.S. is one of the most concerning signs that we're slipping into authoritarianism.
What do you expect to be the next chapter, the next step in Donald Trump's conflict with the media?
It's hard to tell what this man is going to do next. I don't think we'll see any let up on the pressure. What I really hope that ABC does, and that the tremendous viewing audience that they had last night when Jimmy Kimmel came back will send some message and embolden other people who are faced with these threats to stop capitulating and to show them that there's no benefit to trying to please this president with these things. He's just going to continue to attack you, no matter how often you give in and think that you've resolved the matter by trying to make him happy. And that's what ABC did. They had earlier settled a very frivolous and meritless lawsuit for a large amount of money, apparently thinking that would, get the president off their back. That's never going to happen. You have to stand up for your principles in the first, and then hold on to them steadily. And the public will support you when you do that.
That's David Green of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Pleasure speaking to you today.
Thank you so much.
The U.S. president has signaled a surprise shift on the war in Ukraine. He said Kyiv could, with the support of the European Union, recover all the territory it has lost to Russia. In a social media post, Donald Trump said Ukraine would be able to take back their country in its original form and, who knows, maybe even go further than that. Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. He made these remarks after meeting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Trump had earlier suggested Kyiv would need to give up land to Moscow in any potential peace deal. Zelensky unsurprisingly welcomed Trump's new perspective.
It's a big shift by President Trump. This post of Trump, it's a big shift. What do you expect from NATO in the next 2 years?
For more on Trump's comments about the war in Ukraine, I'm joined by Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and special representative for Ukraine negotiations. Mr. Volker, welcome back to DW. Now, what was your first reaction when you heard what President Trump wrote about Ukraine?
Well, I thought it was amusing because clearly what he's doing is he is trying to troll President Putin of Russia. He's criticizing the Russian economy, saying it's in terrible shape. He's criticizing the military, saying they're not a great power, that any good military would have defeated Ukraine in a week, and here they are struggling after 3 years, saying Ukraine should take all its territory back and maybe even more. So I think what he's doing here is he's trying to get under Putin's skin because he is frustrated that Putin is not making any effort to end the war. What was also interesting in that Truth Social post is that he wasn't taking any responsibility himself or for the United States. He was basically waving at Europe and Ukraine and saying, good luck.
President Zelensky, nonetheless, did hail this as a big shift. That's, in your opinion, then not what this is?
Well, I would say it is a shift because his rhetoric in the past had been much more negative toward Ukraine. If you think back to that meeting in February in the Oval Office, Trump was saying, you don't have any cards. Well, now he's saying that he's reviewed the economic and military situation and he thinks that Ukraine can win. So that is a shift from President Trump's side.
Is it a meaningful shift,
but it
though,
is,
or is it just him flip-flopping again?
Well, you know, it's meaningful in terms of attitude, but it is not meaningful in terms of U.S. action because he's still not indicating that he's going to put tough sanctions in place on Russia or secondary sanctions. He's not providing any additional support to Ukraine other than what European allies are going to buy and provide. So he's not offering anything. So I don't think it is significant in terms of the U.S. policy posture, but at least Trump's attitude and his comments there are encouraging and probably encouraging for European allies as well.
You mentioned that you think it's Trump trying to get under Putin's skin. He repeatedly said in recent days that he thought that the Ukraine war would be the easiest conflict for him to solve precisely because of that good relationship he has with Vladimir Putin. Could this then be a negotiating tactic, getting under Putin's skin to what end?
Yeah, to get him to actually negotiate an end to the war. We haven't seen that yet. And I think that Trump still wants to get a deal. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize, of course, but he also wants to be able to lift sanctions and start doing business with Russia. He's talked a lot about minerals, oil, gas, Arctic exploration. So Trump sees that as very desirable, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And so he really wants to get Putin engaged in ending the war. Putin, for his part, I think he understands that that is what Trump wants. So he dangles that kind of cooperation in front of him without actually taking any steps to end the war. I don't think Putin is motivated by the business deals at all. He's motivated by rebuilding the Russian Empire.
How do you think this post and the tone went down with European leaders and NATO allies here in Europe?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think most European allies were happy to see this. It's a relief to have something as close to the real situation as possible, but also everyone holding their breath because who knows, tomorrow he may do the opposite again. And so everyone is pleased with what they saw, but also not convinced that this is a major change.
Mm-hmm. I want to look at how realistic what he claimed in that Truth Social post is, and something that the Ukrainian leader, of course, embraced, and it emboldened him today when he spoke in front of the United Nations. Trump stressed that Ukraine could win all its territory back with the support of Europe, but even at the height of U.S. support, that was an unattainable goal. Militarily, how far is Ukraine right now from being able to seize everything that's currently under Russian military control?
Right. So first off, I don't believe there ever was a time when we had a height of American military support. The Biden administration was always holding back, both in terms of the types of weapons and equipment we would provide, their use, their range, the timing of deliveries. So we never had a height of American support. As far as Ukraine being able to win, this is in the context of the way the war has changed over 3.5 years. Russia now is considerably weaker than it was in February of 22. And Ukraine is, I would argue, considerably stronger than it was in February of 22. They have developed a whole new way of warfare using drones. They are producing them domestically in Ukraine and in very large numbers. And their economy is more stable, thanks to European support, than Russia's. Russia has very high inflation, very high interest rates, a labor shortage, unsustainable casualty rates. They've destroyed a lot of their military equipment and are dependent on Iran for drones and North Korea for artillery shells. So Russia is in a weaker position. If this trend continues, and particularly if we can dry up the flow of hard currency to Russia to pay for the war effort, it is possible for Ukraine to win.
Mm-hmm. Trump ended his post by wishing both countries well. What does that tell us about which side he's on here?
Well, that's sort of his general closing. Normally when he writes a tweet, he says, thank you for your attention to this matter. It is I'd say fairly empty closing, fairly tongue-in-cheek as well. In this case, I think he's referring to the Russian people and the Ukrainian people. And he does have a sympathy for the young people who are losing their lives in this war. So he wishes everybody well, and he wants Russia to be a normal, successful country, just that they're not that under Vladimir Putin. And I think that the overall tone of that post, however, was to be much more supportive of Ukraine and condemning Russia for the invasion and the continued war.
That's Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Thank you so much for your insights and your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Here in Germany, the armed forces say they are experiencing a surge in interest in voluntary military service. The Inspector General says that there has been a 15% rise in applications year on year. Young Germans can serve on a voluntary basis between 7 and 23 months. Now, Germany abolished mandatory military service back in 2011, but since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, calls have grown louder to reintroduce it. The majority in Germany supports reintroducing mandatory military service, but a recent poll on whether Germans would be willing to take up arms in the event of a military attack painted a very different picture. Just 16% said they would definitely defend the country. A further 22% said probably, but a majority of 59% said they would probably not or definitely not defend Germany if attacked. Let's bring in Sophia Besch. She's an expert in German security and defense policy and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Europe program. Welcome to DW. So we hear that more young people are signing up for voluntary military service, but that's a rather short-term program. Does that have any impact at all on the recruitment problems of the Bundeswehr?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Well, that is the hope of the Defense Ministry and the Defense Minister for sure. So Pistorius, like many other defense minister in Europe, has a real personnel problem, both with recruitment and with retention. And the hope is that if you get people to join this voluntary military service, that they will then enter the reserves after, that you can build up a reserve that you can call upon in a crisis. So yes, this does hopefully make a difference. If we look at, though, the larger numbers that are required to get to some of the targets that the Bundeswehr has set itself in terms of recruitment, then this might just be the start.
I have some numbers here, and they might be interesting to our viewers. In 10 years, the German army wants to increase its personnel by 90,000. That is 50% of the troops the German army has right now. How realistic is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, since the suspension of conscription in 2011, overall Bundeswehr numbers have basically plateaued at around 180,000. These numbers that might even be a little bit on the optimistic side are derived from NATO targets. So it is what Germany has committed that it will contribute to NATO's defense in the future. Big question marks over whether this will be possible with this sort of hybrid voluntary military service model that Pistorius has introduced now. I think there are many voices you will hear in the Defense Ministry, in the Chancellery, in the Foreign Ministry, who think that we might have to return to a more mandatory model than this. But it is not even just whether you can get people to sign up. It's also having to build up the capacities, the training capacity, the screening capacity, the administrative bureaucracy around recruitment and conscription. Right now, these facilities are just not there. We're going to have to build the plane while we fly it.
Build the plane while we fly it, and we'll have to find some passengers. And the Bundeswehr, especially among young people, doesn't necessarily have the best reputation. Also, there is a war raging not far away. So how is the German army trying to reach potential recruits?
Yeah, so I think there is a very focused sort of awareness campaign happening right now. So The German army is attempting to reach young people through social media targeting. The Bundeswehr has a TikTok. The Bundeswehr has an Instagram. There are much more local events happening throughout Germany now, with the armed forces going into schools, talking to future graduates about a career in the armed forces. We will have this new questionnaire that is going to be sent out to young men and women, asking them about their willingness to serve starting next year. And that is just seen as a way to reach people who might not have thought about the military before and just put this career as an option in front of them.
And it calls for mandatory military service. Sorry, because we're reaching the end of the show and there's so much more to get to. Calls for mandatory military service have, of course, been growing louder. Young people are not fond of the idea. In your opinion, is it the only way to go for the Bundeswehr to get enough personnel?
I think it's a really risky way. Nobody wants to force this issue. I think it has to be based on a willingness to serve, on a willingness to defend your country. Otherwise, you are giving a present to populist parties who might want to take up the mantle of peace party. If you vote for us, your sons and daughters won't have to serve in the military. We are going to have to invest much more in, and I will say the word Zeitenwende, the cultural acceptance both of the military and then also the willingness to defend your country, serve your country, defend the values that you think your country stands for.
Sophia Besch, many thanks. Great speaking to you today.
Thank you.
And that's our time, but make sure to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay in touch. You can follow our team on social media. Our handle there is @DW News. If it's the latest headlines you're looking for, there is, of course, always our website. That's dw.com. For now, from all of us here on The Day, thank you so much for spending part of your day with us. Bye-bye.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who gets to judge who's big or small?
Dieting is deeply political.
Black women were framed as the antithesis of white femininity.
A history of weight and who holds the scale.
Full lips, smooth skin, more shapely contours. Hyaluronic acid injections are booming, and the look has long become a beauty ideal. Yet, in their craze for self-optimization, people often ignore the risks. Some even end up going blind. From hype to hope and harsh reality, the new face. Local conflicts, for territorial influence, about feuds that go back centuries, or for drugs and money. What do such disputes have to do with the rest of us? How explosive are they on a global scale? We take a look at how things began and where they can lead. Decoding Conflicts starts September 28th on DW.
The return of Pulp. We visited the Britpop icons of Common People fame in the studio. But first, our new series, History of Things. Let's take a look at the power and politics behind the dogma of calorie counting.
It's official. Body positivity is out and heroin chic is back in. Our former plus-size heroines have transformed. Stars like Lizzo became famous with empowerment anthems against diet culture. But is all that talk now rendered cheap because, well, they're thin now? Was the self-love movement as fleeting as a dodgy pop-up promising to get rid of belly fat in just 5 days? And why? Maybe because in unstable times we try to control the one thing that we can, our weight. Because dieting is not simply a personal matter. Dieting is deeply political. What does the number on the scale have to do with power, industry, racism, and social control? Let's find out. This is everyday life on social media.
Skinny is the outfit. Being skinny sends a message.
Don't look like an Instagram model or gym bro? Then you're just missing the right skinny girl mindset. The popular hashtag SkinnyTok was officially banned in June 2025, but the toxic content remains. The message? You're not ugly, you're just fat. Ouch. But you think it's never been this bad? Wrong. We've seen it all before. So here's a quick reminder of how things used to be. The motto, nothing tastes as good as skinny feels. In the 90s and 2000s, Kate Moss was one of the most desired models, the face of the heroin chic trend. This was considered too fat at the time. Nicole Richie was called the chubby sidekick of Paris Hilton. Body shaming on the covers of tabloid magazines? Completely normal.
Two right massive fatty siblings are at the peak of their porkiness.
Reality shows describing people as Mr. and Mrs. Massive Fatty? Bizarrely, also normal. The main character in Bridget Jones's Diary weighed 60 to 65 kilograms at 165 centimeters, which is pretty much my height and weight. Sounds average today, but back then it was fat enough to be the entire plot of a movie. Spice Girl Jerry Halliwell was asked to step on a scale during a live TV interview. No joke. The Y2K aesthetic, complete with super low-rise jeans and a morbid fascination with size 0, is back. Ergo, so is being skinny. Diet culture is being rebranded for the hyper-digital age of the 2020s. It's now called Thinspiration, heavily filtered and highly dangerous. Eating disorders and body dysmorphia are on the rise again. Globally, eating disorder cases have roughly doubled in the last 20 years, and the real numbers may be even higher than statistics show. The latest diet wave is a symptom, a sign that something is changing in society, politics, and culture. But why? Social media amplifies an old problem. You're never just dieting for yourself. You're always shaped by your environment and the political context. In politically unstable times, the desire for control grows. War, pandemics, inflation, climate crisis, it's all overwhelming. So we try to control the one thing that we still can, our bodies. Tracking fitness, optimizing, fasting, glowing up, and looks-maxing. Self-discipline becomes a substitute for real security. But we're not just counting calories, we're counting likes. Comments and views reinforce social control, and someone noticed something similar 50 years ago. French philosopher Michel Foucault described a phenomenon typical for us humans in Discipline and Punish. Foucault wouldn't have called it self-optimization, but disciplinary power. We monitor and discipline ourselves because we've internalized norms and ideals. The pressure doesn't come directly from laws or violence, it comes from within. We put the pressure on ourselves. We're not just optimizing our bodies, we're proving our control. But what Foucault likely didn't foresee is that now there are injections promising to make that control even easier, and they're fueling the problem. Oprah Winfrey, Elon Musk, Sharon Osbourne, and many more have publicly admitted they lost weight using injections. How does it work? Our colleagues from the DW Health Desk explained it when the hype began.
The injection was originally developed for people with type 2 diabetes. Now it's been approved for people with obesity. The drug has various effects. It mimics a messenger substance produced naturally in the body, the hormone GLP-1, which is normally released by the intestines. Taken as a drug, it slows down the movements in the stomach so the food you've eaten stays there longer. If your stomach stays full, you don't feel hungry as often, so you lose weight.
Now, apparently, anyone can lose weight. Well, as long as they can afford it. These drugs are considered lifestyle meds and must be paid for out of pocket. Many people now access them without medical necessity, through lax doctors, online platforms, or private imports. The market is already huge and is growing fast. Currently, the global market is worth about $60 billion. By 2035, it's projected to exceed $157 billion. Where are these weight loss shots most popular? No surprise, in wealthy countries where obesity is common, especially in the US and Europe. The typical users? White, well-insured, high income. People with lower incomes or no insurance have far less access to these drugs, even though they often face higher obesity risks. The global boom in weight loss injections isn't just about body image, it's about inequality. Rich, white, and thin, this ideal dominated way before Ozempic came along.
There has never been a moment in the history of the world in which all of the global inhabitants have been slender.
Fat reserves ensured survival during lean times. In the Middle Ages, a large belly was a status symbol. Even during the Renaissance and Baroque periods, fuller bodies were celebrated in the Western world. This was the beauty ideal. Why? Because most people lived in poverty and worked physically hard. Roundness wasn't the norm, it was a luxury, and therefore desirable.
When slavery hit the Western world, there needed to be ongoing rationales for what is inevitably an immoral and dehumanizing enterprise. Rather than saying, okay, well, we're using these people because they're cheap labor, we're using these people because of their skin color, more understandings that were stereotypical about supposed behavioral traits were imputed into racial scientific theories. By the middle of the 18th century, there was the idea that, wait a minute, it's not just a matter of skin color and geographic location like we thought at first when we were buying and stealing human beings. It's actually a matter of constitutional differences. Constitutionally, Western Christian Europeans, the people we identify as white, were just more disciplined, more self-controlled, more restrained. And the people from Africa who are dark-skinned, who we identify as black, they just are consumed with sex and food.
With the import of sugar, cocoa, palm fat, and alcohol from colonized regions, dietary habits in the Western world began to shift. While the white upper class could afford to indulge, this specific ideal simultaneously gained importance: disciplined, slender, white. It wasn't about beauty or health, but about distinction from the others. A well-known example of the extent to which black women were objectified is Sarah Zachi Baartman, a Khoikhoi woman from South Africa. In the 19th century, she was exhibited in Europe like a sideshow curiosity and became a canvas for people to project their colonial fantasies.
She was deemed to be a, quote, perfect specimen of Africanity. They came to this analysis based on the size and shape of her body, not just her buttocks and labia, but her whole body. What they argued was that she was 3 yards and 3/4 round. Black women were framed as the antithesis of white femininity. And so there was this sense that blackness was related to fatness.
This is how full-blown fat phobia became part of a racist ideology. Thinness turned into a cultural marker of white supremacy. What was considered beautiful was never just a matter of personal taste. It was always about power. And that legacy still influences our beauty standards today. You can starve yourself, but you can't change your genetics. And then a brand new unit of measurement entered the game and pushed it even further. In the early 1820s, French scientist Nicolas Clément defined the calorie as a unit of thermal energy, originally meant for steam engines, not for human bodies. During the Industrial Revolution, scientists began applying the term to human metabolism. How much can a worker produce? How much energy do they use? The combustion engine was no longer just the locomotive, it became the human body. And just like that, the calorie became a benchmark for efficiency, control, and standardization. Great invention. Thanks, Nicholas. Suddenly, our relationship with food could be broken down into a clinical unit. How much energy is in a piece of bread? Or how many calories does a walk burn? The calorie is still the ultimate tool of self-optimization, and as fitness influencers love to tell us, weight loss is as simple as calories in versus calories out. Right. But there is another unit, an older invention, that still lingers. The basic idea behind our BMI comes from the 1830s, created by Adolphe Quetelet, a Belgian mathematician, astronomer, and statistician. He developed an index to describe the average man, purely statistical, not medical. His dataset was based mainly on white, male, European bodies.
An astronomer who had no relationship whatsoever to health outcomes and no relationship whatsoever to medicine created a tool that would ultimately be co-opted by the medical field. First by a eugenicist named Charles Davenport, who was very concerned about so-called racial obesity, which is already a red flag. And later by a nutritionist by the name of Ancel Keys, who was very popular as a physician in the United States.
Ancel Keys himself emphasized that the BMI was useful for population-wide statistics, but not appropriate for judging the health of individuals.
Why would we expect that people, regardless of gender identity, regardless of genetics, family history, diet, exercise, geographic location, why would we expect that people with this myriad backgrounds should all be labeled healthy by one weight-based tool? Why should we expect a Samoan to weigh the same thing as someone who is in Vietnam or someone who is in Australia? None of that makes any sense.
The BMI doesn't distinguish fat from muscle. A muscular athlete and a sedentary person could have the same BMI, even though their health status and fitness levels are completely different. And yet, we still rely on it today. And another insight from the industrial era that still holds true today: there is big money to be made from people who want to lose weight. What TikTok is today, fashion magazines were back then. And yes, the fashion of the 1920s was iconic, but to fit into those dresses, you needed a slim silhouette. The Roaring Twenties brought a new image of femininity: flapper girls, young, independent, rebellious, and noticeably thin. Calorie charts became hugely popular. Lulu Hunt Peters published the first bestseller on weight loss and the first book to recommend counting calories to achieve a modern look. Many women tried to stay under 1,200 calories a day. How? By smoking, for example. Cigarettes as appetite suppressants. The ads said it all. This was the beginning of a booming slimming product industry. Laxatives, diuretics, even tapeworm pills were sold. There were even bath salts and soaps advertised to wash the fat away. Scientific proof? Of course not. In much of the Western world, the war years were marked by scarcity, poverty, and food rationing. So it's no coincidence that after World War II, the hourglass figure came back into fashion. Curves, yes, but only in the right places. Why? Post-war society needed babies to rebuild the population, and curves were symbols of health, fertility, and domestic femininity. With economic prosperity came a return to traditional gender roles. The ideal wife was supposed to be domestic and composed, but also attractive and seductive. Industry stepped in to help shape desirable female bodies. Shapewear, corsets, and pointy-cup bras flooded the market. And this is when the first meal replacement products were developed. Diet shakes meant to replace real meals. They tasted questionable. They still sold incredibly well.
Mit geschwellter Brust sah die Männerwelt, wie das schwache Geschlecht sich bemühte, seine starken Seiten hervorzukehren.
And what about the men? They weren't expected to look pumped like bodybuilders, but rather athletic and healthy, like Elvis or Cary Grant. But anyone who promised a dream body could make a fortune, even back then.
Diese mittelalterlich anmutende Streckvorrichtung fanden wir in einem Kosmetikinstitut in New York, wo man den unerwünschten Polstern mit den letzten Errungenschaften der Technik zu Leibe rückt.
To illustrate, she was considered too plump at the time. Miss Fat and Beautiful. So better hop on an exercise bike or other newly invented contraptions.
Ein kompletter Maschinenpark dient dem Ziel der größten und internationalsten Frauenbewegung aller Zeiten, schlank zu werden.
The greatest international women's movement of all time is to become slim. Yes, that is an actual quote from the news back then. So it's no wonder that diet clubs like Weight Watchers attracted members like the promise of a zero-calorie banoffee pie. In the 1980s, everyone was doing aerobics or bodybuilding. The fitness industry exploded. The diet industry boomed too, but so did the fast food industry. Genius marketing hacks of that time. Coca-Cola introduced Diet Coke. McDonald's sold chicken nuggets as lighter fast food options. So people were both eating more and starving more too. Paradoxical, isn't it? Burning calories became a mass movement and was marketed cleverly. And it wasn't just about economics, it was political too. The diet craze of the 1980s cannot be separated from the political climate at the time.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
It means everyone is personally responsible for their health. The state cut social services. Food stamp eligibility became stricter. It became even harder for low-income families to access fresh, healthy food. In this neoliberal mindset, being thin and fit meant being more productive, more moral, more patriotic. And once again, the old stigma fits perfectly into conservative values. Fatness equals a lack of self-control. Fitness, dieting, obesity, and eating disorders became constant topics in the media throughout the 1990s. And guess what? We found something in our archives.
If you want to look good, presumably you have to be kind of relatively thin too. Is that an important issue in fitness?
Well, I think we're going to see later on in the program that being thin doesn't necessarily mean being fit. It's really important that people feel good in their bodies, and so you can't say that thin people feel good and fat people feel bad about their bodies. That's really not the case. But on the other hand, I would say that it's true that if you are overweight, you will have a certain number of disadvantages for your health, and a lot of people often think that they don't feel good when they're fat, and so it is perhaps important to take care about what you eat so that you do feel good about your body.
Even back then, there was a counter-movement to the skinny trend.
You are a member of Dicke e.V., which, for want of a better translation, is something like Fatties Club, which is for fat German women who are proud of being fat. What's your criticism of this whole fitness fad?
I think it's very nice if people enjoy their bodies. And if someone's got a dream about how they want their body to look, and they're able to realize it in a fitness studio, then I have no problem about that at all. I think that's great. The only thing I think is if you go there and from the very beginning hate your body because you've got some internalized image of how it's supposed to be, and it's not allowed to be the way it is, and I have to do this and that, and only when I look this way can I be happy. So you basically hate the situation is the way it is, and then you go to the fitness studio. I think that's a fight that you'll never manage to win.
Everything our guest said back then, it's exactly what we've heard in body positivity campaigns in recent years. Those voices still exist, they've just become quieter. The diet industry has been selling us the same thing for over 100 years, only the packaging changes. We're living in a time where right-wing populist parties are gaining power worldwide. Diversity is being pushed into the background. The current obsession with being skinny, we've seen it all before. It mirrors what we saw in colonial beauty standards. Slim, rational, controlled, white. Dieting has always been political. It's never just about lifestyle. It reflects our cultural climate. What's new is that social media has turbocharged the need to be beautiful. Dieting is about more than just weight loss. It's about power, status, and control.
From the power of the diet industry to the power of the everyday, Britpop legends Pulp celebrate the magic of ordinary lives.
I am not Jesus, though I have the same initials. I am the man who stays home and does the dishes. Why is that going to be controversial in Germany?
Because Germans hate dishes.
Jarvis Cocker is a kind of grown-up Harry Potter, too clever for pop music. After 24 years, his band Pulp, the best of all possible Britpop bands, has released a new album with the understated title, More. It's dance music about growing old, and typically for Pulp, it's at once very funny and deeply sad.
There's no irony at all in Pulp music. I'm sorry to disappoint everybody.
She was so popular, temperate.
To me, what irony means trying to keep a safe distance from the world and from life so you don't get hurt or whatever. And my attitude to music is the complete opposite of that. Maybe in normal life I'm a bit at a distance because I'm quite a shy person, but what I try to do in songs is to look at things that interest me or frighten me or make me excited, and I try and get to know what I think about them by writing about them. So there's no ironic distance from it at all.
With Pulp, Cocker masterfully captured the everyday life of the working class. He is a witty, insightful observer of modern life and people.
Help the aged. One time they were just like you. Drinking, smoking, sex and sniffing glue.
I was only 33 when I wrote that, but I never wanted to get older. I'm 61 now, so I'm old. Some people age quite well. Some people have just like lost it, you know. Some people are just like kind of tumbleweed blowing down the street.
A visit to Pulp in the London studio, where they're rehearsing for a concert tour. The latest album focuses on transience.
The first time I realised that I was going to die was when I was a child, and it frightened me to death. My grandfather was an undertaker, so there were a lot of coffins around, and my cousins were girls, and they used to do these kind of fake funerals where they would put their dolls in these coffins and then they would walk them to the end of the garden and say they were going to bury them.
Something changed and then that's it, everybody's free to feel good.
To be free. It took 16 years for Pulp to finally find success, and after 4 hit albums, it was all over very quickly. Cocker then did chamber music with Chilly Gonzales, as well as an album of house music. And then he moved to Paris.
Oh, can't you see? I'm ready now.
Pulp never did anything by halves. The band reunited for concerts. The old songs were as magnificent as ever, and then came new ones.
I wasn't brought up in a very musical household. My father did sing and stuff, but he left home when I was 7. My mother absolutely could not sing, although that didn't put her off doing it whenever she went to a church or something, and she would sing very loudly, but just on one note all the time. The Beatles were #1 in the charts the day I was born. All my formative years were under this kind of gentle cloud of the Beatles. And what the Beatles said was, ordinary working class people can create. You don't have to just go and work in a factory and die at the age of 40 from inhaling poisonous fumes. You can create, you can make stuff. Not only can you create stuff that is as good as the high-class art, you can make something that's better than that.